afternoon session, and our next speaker is Professor Helga Nowotny. It's a big pleasure to introduce her. She's a Professor Emerita at ETH Zurich and also former President of European Research Council, and she has a very long list of distinguished awards. You can read yourself. Among them, she has a gold medal of Academia Europaea and a British Academy President's medal. Professor Nowotny has also a lot of publications, and she recently published a very interesting book, which I also recommend, where it just was published last year. It's called An Orderly Mess, and quite intriguing name and quite intriguing book too. She has a long-going connection with Singapore, and actually gave some very interesting talks on different topics. And one of the last, I guess, was on evolution, which actually connects to the previous talk that we just heard. It was, I think, a humble view from inside of evolution. So, as always, we look forward to this exciting talk, and let us welcome Helga Nowotny.
Thank you very much, Philip. Can you hear me also in the back of the room? Can you hear me in the back of the room? Good, thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be back. My first Complexity meeting, thanks to Jan Fassbinder and others, was the crude look at the whole, which was a conference that many of us remember. And I'm sure also today's topic is something that will be remembered. So let me start by showing you an editorial letter that appeared in February this year in the magazine Wired, that several of you know. It's a technology magazine, widely read. And they were celebrating their 25th birthday. And so it says, the next 25 years begin today. If you want to move beyond, dig into reading our magazine, look no further, and then it comes. Because in a world in constant motion, we don't have a minute to lose. And I want to challenge this. Wait a moment. We don't have 1 minute to lose. On the contrary, I think we need 1 minute or more to reflect on where we are and what we are doing. Because in many respects, humanity may find well itself at a junction. Some speak about the fourth industrial revolution. In fact, we have heard a reference to it in the morning. Others speak about the digital age, and many of us are convinced that we have entered the era of the Anthropocene, even if the Geological Union has not yet officially agreed to that, because they have some hard work to do on the ground and in the rocks. And this junction poses some questions. If indeed automation, digitalization takes over sooner than we want it to take over, perhaps, does it mean that the prediction that John Maynard Keynes made in 1929, speaking about the economic situation for our grandchildren, this was the title of his talk, and his prediction was, among many other things, that by 2029 we will be working 3 hours per day. So are we nearing, in date certainly, but are we nearing to see this prediction fulfilled? Or will we become the slaves to the machines that we are already addicted to, machines that don't need much in terms of nourishing, of cultivation, or perhaps even worse, that can do entirely without us, that don't even need our attention? Or, if you read the book by Nick Bostrom, Superintelligence, is humanity moving towards the two options that he describes? One is extinction, easy, and we heard what extinctions happened before on this planet, or will we become a technologically mature civilization that will move into outer space? These are just some of the options that humanity faces. And I think they are worth to take 1 minute, or maybe the 45 minutes that Jan allotted to us to discuss some of these issues. And I want to do this by introducing you to what I call the complexity of timescapes, and introduce you to the concept of timescape. My thanks go to Barbara Adams, a social scientist who first spoke about timescape in '98 and then again in 2008. And think of a timescape of something like a landscape, but it has this fourth temporal dimension to it. And it's a way that helps us to conceptualize social time. I will speak about social time, time that we construct in society that is, of course, related to biological time, it's related to physical time, but it is social time. And what the concept of timescape allows us to do is to make some sense, to give some meaning to these multiple coexisting forms of time. We heard Jeff speaking about universal time. But there's not only universal time, there is a very banal matter, the kind of coordinated time that brings us together in this room at 2 o'clock on the 19th of March. And it's Singaporean time, even if some of us may still feel a bit of jet lag, because we come from another coordinating system of time. It also allows us to think about the interfaces of the time we experience. We experience it at both biological beings, jet lag is the clear evidence for that, but also as social beings, because we are constantly in a coordinating action with others. If we interconnect, if we talk to each other, we are populating the same kind of timescape. And the term of concept of timescape is also linked to the fact that we as social beings are very much tied to space. We are in a room, we are tied to materiality, the infrastructure in which we move, and again, Jeff gave some very convincing examples before. But the concept of timescape privileges the temporal dimension in this interaction with space and with materiality. So what does this concept allow us to do? What is the approach, the perspective, once we start to think in terms of a timescape that allows us to discuss, perhaps compare, several structural features that every timescape has. It's a bit like a map, like a cartography. Cartographers are able to compare maps, they have their rules, and you are able to get a wider picture through comparison. And here, these are some of the structural dimensions that the concept of timescape allows you to raise as a question. What is the time frame we are choosing? And it's always a choice. It's the question we have that determines the time frame we use. And again, the lecture given by Doug Irwin just before we broke for lunch is a beautiful example for how different time frames allow you or compel you to ask different kinds of questions. Temporality, how does time move, flow, evolve? What is the temporality? And again, it varies between timescapes. Timing, the very important question, also in terms of your careers, in terms of the life decisions that you make. When do you choose what? What are the decisions you make and when? And we know there are good timings and there are not so good timings. Tempo, at what speed, again, Douglas was speaking about that. Duration, how long, what is the short-term, the mid-term, the long-term perspective, what is our concept of duration? And there are different ways of answering the concept of duration. Sequence, in what order? Is it parallel? Is it ordered? In which way? And then, of course, for us in a society, what are the temporal modalities when we distinguish between something that is past, something that is present, and something that is future? And these are not very clear distinctions. In fact, they have moved in the history of humanity many, many times. So I invite you to think with me and to visualize a timescape in different ways. And this is just meant to, to incentivize your imagination, because we cannot see a timescape. We can see space, we can see an infrastructure, but we cannot see a timescape in reality. We have to have visual representations that appeal to our imagination. This is one of them, and of course it links us with where we come from, the very beginning of the universe, the beginning of the earth, and the way how it continues to evolve. This is another way, a beautiful book by Darcy Thompson, written almost 100 years ago. I think there was a celebration last year about it, on growth and forms in organisms. Another timescape that is being appealed to, and a way to visualize a timescape. And my favorite visual representation is the one by biologist Waddington, who was the one who discovered epigenetics, and he calls it the epigenetic landscape. And if you think of the epigenetic landscape as a way of tilting, you can move it backwards, forwards, and you will see how the development of the organisms, according to the non-hereditary, non-DNA linked environmental factors, will move, which is the concept of epigenetics. So these are just some ways of visualizing what I mean by timescape and what I want to speak about. Now, remember what I said, a timescape needs a frame. We choose the frame. And what I want to do is to show you 3 different timescapes of complexity. Complexity enters into these timescapes because there is a lot of interaction going on between many different variables, parameters, dimensions. There's an emergence of some very specific temporal orders in these timescapes, as I will try to show, and they are subject to continuous change. Once you have a certain timescape, does not mean it will always remain the same. And I have selected these in order to give you a feeling, both for the emergence of something new, for the way how the complexity also is rearranged and changed, and to end up with the last timescape, what I call the timescape of the now, to raise some of the questions that I think many in the audience keep asking. How is it all related to our present situation now in society, in the world that in many ways seems to be in a mess? So let me start with the timescape of societal change. But as I said, we cannot have direct access to timescape. And in order to get a sense of it, we need our imagination. And imagination is a very important human attribute. It is essential for scientific creativity, it's essential for artistic creativity, and we use it all the time. Without imagination, we would really be like robots. And people working on robots have a very difficult time to figure out how can we make robots more imaginary and give them more imagination. But so far, it is a distinctively human ability that we have. And Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction writer, she herself preferred to speak about speculative history, who recently passed away. She had this beautiful sentence, storytelling, narratives. It's our only boat for sailing on the river of time. So, and this imagination also means, and I will speak a lot about also the collective imaginaries people have at different times in history. So it's individual imagination, but it's also collective imaginaries. These ephemeral ways of how we use individually our imagination, but they also come together, they combine in something that becomes a collective imaginary. So let us look at timescapes of societal change. And here we very much depend on narrative, on stories that we tell each other. And it's interesting, and anthropologists know very much about this because they have been researching and have been accumulating the many origin stories that people before us, tribes, social groupings, have been telling themselves and their descendants. Where do we come from? And there are these origin myths, as we call them. God created the world. You can also call it an origin myth. But also it's a rich variety, very imaginative, how human beings came to populate the world. And in these anthropological accounts, it's interesting also from a linguistic point of view, because very often the very concept of human is tied to the language of that particular group that is spoken. So we are the ones who are the result of this origin myth. Then we have other stories that we have been telling each other, stories about the Golden Age and its aftermath. And it's a seemingly very simple story, namely that everything was much, much better when it started. The Golden Age, the paradise. And what happened since was a way down on the decline. And these are stories that are still with us. It's not something that we have left behind. They are still with us. They crop up at unexpected times and places. We have stories that we call the cycles of eternal return. Nietzsche was one of the writers who spoke about it. But the eternal return also means that there are times when things go up and when things come down. Only they reiterate themselves in more or less the same way. But again, this idea of a cycle of returning to something that was there in the past is still with us. And then there are the stories about the way how people imagine how society, how humanity has changed, are tied to the idea that is so familiar to us because we are part of this story. We are born, we mature, we decay, we die. And this is the organic pattern that we are part of. And this has been used again as another story that we told ourselves about societal change. One very famous, but perhaps infamous one, was written 100 years ago, 1918, by Oswald Spengler, and it became an immediate bestseller because it had the very challenging title, The Decline of the West. And some people now think back in 2018 of Spengler saying, well, you know, the decline of the West story is still with us, and now we see with the rise of China, the West is declining. So much for a repetition also of some of these stories that we were telling us. So who was this Oswald Spengler? It was written in after the very gruesome experience of the First World War. Oswald Spengler was German. He had a nostalgia for the Kaiserreich. He did not think much of democracy as the form of governance replacing the empire and the leader in form of the Kaiser. But he maintained, and this is why the book had such a huge impact, also timing is important, he maintained that all great civilizations, he goes back to the Babylonians, the Mayan, all civilizations, great civilizations in the history of humanity, went through this cycle of birth, of fulfillment, of decline, and of death. And people were discussing this quite a lot. Of course, there were other cyclic stories. I just want to mention one here, Kondratiev. Economists know about the Kondratiev waves. He was a Marxist economist, and he wrote his book in 1928, so 10 years after Spengler. And he showed the data that he had accumulated that innovations take 50 to 60 years to come to fruition, and then it's over, but a new innovation comes up. And not so long ago, people were still reading and speaking about the Kondratiev waves. Now it has gone a bit out of fashion, but it's interesting that some people say, well, we correlated it with the Standard & Poor 500 index for financial markets, and lo and behold, we can see a correlation. But, so these were the narratives, appealing to our collective imaginaries. And as you can see from the diversity of these narratives, they are similar and different, and they tend to coexist somehow. None has completely been set aside, but nevertheless, we don't think of this anymore in the same way. So what is our perception? What is our timescape now? And here something occurred which is very interesting from a historical point of view and of the consequences it had. And this occurred roughly around 1820. And what you see here, and you can always question, you know, can you really compare GDP across all these years? But by and large, historians, economic historians, economists are in agreement. Not much happened in terms of raising wealth, of raising productivity before the 1820s, roughly. It coincided, there was a bit of, you know, the time scale varies, it coincided with the change in energy sources, very important, and Jeff also alluded to this already. Before, people had to rely on energy from wind, from water mills, from animals, donkeys, horses, etc. Basically, these were the main sources of energy. And all of a sudden, fossil fuels came to become the most important energy resource. And we also see other repercussions of what happened then. life expectancy globally, and this time also with world regions, started to go up. And it started roughly again in this first half of the 19th century. But also, if you look at data like this, the height, these are old bones that were found, and Swedish soldiers, and how they became much taller than others before. And then there are graphs of this kind that tell you how indeed both the diversification but also the sheer amount of energy supply and energy consumption went up. So what does this tell us in terms of our timescape and changes in the timescape? The storyline, the message, is a very simple one. The future no longer looks like the past. This is what people started to realize first in Europe, because my very first graph here was first noticed in Europe and then gradually spreading. The future no longer looks like the past. Now, before I go into what this actually meant to people and what it means for us now, let me just say a word of caution about graphs. We take graphs for granted. We think they're something natural. You look at data, you come up with a graph. But graphs were completely unknown or very uncommon before 1850. Only then did people have the idea, we can put our empirical data into graphs. And again, graphs are a visual representation of something else. And so my caveat is what we are telling here with these and other graphs is already a part of this new timescape. Namely, it's a story of progress. It's a story of the future is no longer identical to the past. The experience that people have and their expectations started to diverge. And this is what a German historian by the name of Reinhard Koselleck, he called it the saddle time, Sattelzeit. And in his historical work, he shows that roughly between 1750 and 1850, this divergence between what people experienced, how their lives were different from the lives of their parents, but also their expectations, what they expected for themselves, for their children, started to differ from that of their parents. So something momentous happened there in this century. And what happened is that the future became perceived to be open, an open horizon in front of people. Before that, for the vast majority of people on the earth, the future was something that was predetermined. It was the gods, it was fate, it was destiny. People had different names for a future that seemed already settled. And the most you could do, was to try to persuade through prayers, through oracles, through various other kind of devices to change a little bit what was already set before you and by powers that were not listening to you. So this experience of an open future, this experience and expectation going in different directions, the expectation that there will be a future that is better than the past. Of course, we're very much linked to science.
They were linked to a technology. Technology had always existed, but it was only around that time that people could actually see technology and science are delivering something that we can tangibly see that makes our life better in some ways. And so, and this is the first message I want you to take with you. A new timescape became institutionalized. This timescape that has this open future, a timescape where the past and the future are not identical anymore, where the future will be better, where there will be progress. And this kind of institutionalization is also very important when we speak about evolution and about Darwin, 1859, the origin of species. I would say that Darwin would not have been possible without this institutionalized timescape. Had Darwin lived 200 years before, his ideas would have been like the ideas of, I don't know, Giordano Bruno, or there are many historical figures whose ideas were premature because society was unable to pick them up, not because they did not want it, but the groundwork, the background was not there. The timescape was not the right one. And so to think about Darwinian evolution, think of it as something that happens in this timescape. If you think of other thinkers that moved the world, be it Hegel or Marx, again, it's a perspective that could only happen in this kind of timescape. And also, if you think of the humanities started with being able to look back at the past to see something like the history of art, the history of ideas, as something that you can now enter and look at and date it and then move forward. So, as I said, the future is open, and science played a big role in that. But with it, also, the sense of uncertainty became a much more dominant one. Why? Because science, in my view, thrives on uncertainty. Science wants to push forward into the territory of what is not yet known. Scientists are very much at ease with uncertainty because they are attracted, they are stimulated by what is not known as yet. And therefore, this is one of the driving forces for science to move on and to transform, to take up what is uncertain knowledge into something that eventually becomes certain knowledge, knowing all the time that certainty in science is always preliminary. There will be new knowledge that comes forth that will supplant, modify the knowledge that was thought to be certain before. Now, there was, this of course is also tied to the promises of science. The promise, and science has to promise more than it can deliver because it's always one step ahead in this uncertainty. Sometimes they do too much and then it's not good because then you are caught if you cannot deliver. But certain promises that science has been sending out to society have been very important to keep both science and society going. Now, something I would say is happening now to this very powerful narrative of progress, the very powerful story that we kept hearing, it will become better and better and better. Now, there have been crises in the idea of progress before, one of the early crises in the idea of progress occurred right after the beginning of modern science. And it occurred because, let me remind you, when science started to become institutionalized, let's look at England in the 17th century. There were other places before, but it did not really take hold, become institutionalized in the sense that we now associate with modern science. This came after a very bloody civil war. And science was seen as something great because scientists, in contrast to warring factions, in contrast to politicians, were able to reach some kind of consensus. They had discovered a method, scientific method, experiments. And even if not everyone agreed, they had established a way of reaching consensus. And so people thought, this is great. Why don't we adopt this scientific method and use it also in the strife of political life? Then something was created in France called the sciences morales, moral sciences, attached very much with the hope, we bring in mathematics, we bring in people like Condorcet, we let them tell us what we need to do in order to achieve this consensus. Well, as we know, it did not work. So this was one of the first instances where this hope and the idea of progress, and belief in progress, suffered. Another big blow to the idea of progress occurred through the First World War, when many people realized this idea of things always becoming better, of humanity moving forward in a one-directional, linear way, was simply not true. And it was an enormous shock to people. This was reflected in the arts, it was reflected in literature, but it was also very much part of the lived experience that people had. And then there were repeated instances, perhaps minor than the two I just sketched, where you had crises in terms of technological progress being questioned, people calling it cultural pessimism, technological pessimism, etc. People saying, well, not everything that technology has promised to bring to us is turning out for our good, etc. So from time to time, we experience this breakdown. And something we see now, and economists like Robert Shiller, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics in the memory of Alfred Nobel, wrote in calling it narrative economics. Now what Shiller did was he went back to data of the 1920s, 30s in the US. He looked at newspapers, at plays, and similar documents to find out what was the dominant story at that time about life getting better for ordinary people. And he found that there was indeed such a dominant narrative. And then he started to look, when did it break down? During the Depression. Sure, it broke down during the Depression. And so he thinks that this is another way how economics can contribute in an empirically based, quantitative way to try to bring in the lived experience of people. To what extent do they believe the dominant narrative? And what we see now, at least for the US, we see that social mobility, the fact that the generations of sons and daughters will reach a better socioeconomic status than their parents, it's no longer the case. And other data for the US show that men in their 30s today, that only half of them earn more than their fathers did when they were 30s. So something is clearly happening and hitting, at least in this part of the world. About inequality, we also have to realize many of the data, the stories we have, they came from the western part of the world. And when we look at the latest data about social mobility, we can see that the middle class in Western countries is indeed going down, while the middle class in this part of the world, in Asia, is rising in terms of its socioeconomic resources and its socioeconomic means. So the view itself, the stories we tell each other, has to take into account a much more differentiated global perspective. Recently, a book came out by Steven Pinker, a linguist working at Harvard, and the book consists essentially of 72 graphs. And the graphs have been well researched, and the graphs have one message: life is becoming better for all of us. And he goes into the usual stories, longevity, health, etc., but also into wars. He maintains that we have far fewer wars today than we ever had. We have far fewer victims as a result of wars, etc. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the graphs, etc. Essentially, I think it's not the graphs that are to be faulted, although please remember the caveat that I said before: the graphs are part of our story that we tell each other. But the way how Pinker presents it is a very, in my view, far too simple causal relation, saying why it gets better, it's all due to science and the Enlightenment, and therefore, we need to support science and the Enlightenment. And while I agree that we should support science and the Enlightenment, I think it is too simple a conclusion to draw, because the causality is, it's not a linear causality. And I thought of it, maybe these findings here are the reason why someone like Steven Pinker has to tell his fellow Americans today that life is becoming better. But that's only an afterthought. So if we have now entered a period of what I call in the book An Orderly Mess, the broken timelines, and what we see through the rise of populism and nationalism in Europe, but not only in Europe, we see this very strong tendency to construct imagined continuities. People want to construct an unbroken identity, a purity of lineage that historians say it's just false. It cannot be established in such a way. And yet, we see all these broken timelines coming up. There are new boundaries that are rising between we and them. We are the people, and populists claim that they are the ones who are speaking for the people, and whoever is not in agreement with them is not of the people. So they claim the hegemony in defining who are the people and in speaking for them. And there is a denial of the discontinuity, which is part of human experience. There were good times, but there were also bad times. There were wars and the repercussions. There were uprisings and repression. It was not all a smooth sailing, and there's this denial of the discontinuities. Why? Why now? I think it has to do with the breakdown of trust, the breakdown of legitimation of our political leaders, and trust is essential to keep a political unit, political entity together. So this is where I think we have another narrative coming in, the narrative of an increasing societal complexity, which is different from the narrative everything will become better and we have a linear progress line that we can just follow. And here I want to link to the talk by Douglas before lunch. If we start to look at history and historical data from this perspective, we see these punctuations, these sudden breakdowns, collapses of societies, smaller ones or larger ones. If you think of empires, being a larger unit, it takes longer for empires to collapse, but empires have collapsed, and there are many of them that have collapsed. So why did this happen? And when did it happen? Why? These are very important questions that now are getting more space. We know the work of Jared Diamond, who has been telling us about the collapse of societies, mainly due to climate change and the inability of societies to adapt to the new circumstances. We also have historians like Joseph Tainter, who way back in 1988 maintained that the sheer overload of complexity, however you measure it, can bring a society to collapse. And then there is one interesting project that is relatively recent, started by historians and others, trying to get a Databank. The project is called Global History Databank. And it's a huge network of historians, computer scientists, and others working together, trying to assemble and to collect as many data as possible. In the project so far, they have looked at 400 societies in 30 different regions of the world, going back 10,000 years. And they have tried to distill from these data what are the key variables. They call it the complexity characteristics. They have identified 9 of them. Now, they know the data are very patchy. There are a lot of methodological problems still. But it is one way of trying to account for the fact that societies do collapse. And we understand very little about the reasons why they collapse. So much the timescape of the past. I want to move now to the timescape of imagined futures. Now, as I said, imagination is part of our life, part of us being in this world. And people have always imagined futures. But and there are a multitude of imagined futures. Religions have imagined futures, myths, the destiny of nations, politicians have imagined their future, claiming, destiny has elected me, thrust with destiny, and other ways how the future has been imagined. But I think none has been as consequential and important as the one linked to the rise of capitalism and the way how capitalism imagines futures. And I'm referring here to the work of Jens Beckert, who is an economic sociologist working at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And he very much puts this at the center of his work, that the dynamics of capitalism cannot be understood without this imagined futures that is inherent to capitalism. How is it inherent? Because it's linked to imagining a future in which you have more income, you have more profit if you are in business, and you have more status as a result of having more income, more profit, etc. So This goes far beyond the work of Max Weber, for instance, who tried to link the rise of capitalism to Protestantism as a way of how new ideas came about. And I think there's a point indeed to look at capitalism through the lens of how the future is imagined. What are the main mechanisms for doing so? It's very much premised on two little words: as if. The imagination of as if. Take credit, which is essential to any capitalistic economy. What does credit mean? You give money, resources to someone. You don't know whether the resources will indeed lead to more profit, will be profitable at all, or whether the profit, the credit that you give will go down a sink. And yet you imagine the future and you pretend that the investment that you put into a business will lead to a future as if it will give you more returns. So this is one of the mechanisms. Competition is another one. Competition driving the capitalist economy, we all know how important it is. And it's linked to the imagination. If I don't compete, I will fall back. So again, you imagine yourself in a competition with others, and if you don't keep up, you will fall back, you will fall out of the race. And market creating innovation, this innovation being very much linked to capitalism in the sense of constantly looking for novelty. Where is the innovation that will lead to higher profits, that will, however, costly, give us higher productivity, and will lead also to new forms, inventing new forms of investment. So to imagine the future is fictional because it has not happened as yet, it's fictional, but at the same time it's necessary. It's necessary for the capitalist economy to keep on going. Just like in a democracy, democracy also lives on fiction that is necessary. And so we have to accept this idea that are necessary fictions, way how we imagine the future, that are fictional, there's no way of denying it. At the same time, they are essential and they are necessary to allow us to do what we want to do. And this importance of fictional expectations can be seen in the assessment of the future that pretends that the future will unfold this way. You believe in it, even if you know it may not happen. You believe in it. It's your motivation. The motivational frame includes emotions. And there is perhaps the need for narrative economics too, so that you can also measure it. And something that Arjun Appadurai, an Indian anthropologist, in a very moving book was describing I think 1 decade or longer ago. He was describing the very poor people in Mumbai, who for the first time, through the rise a little bit above the poverty that they had inherited from their parents and from the system of the society into which they were born, how these people for the first time started to imagine a future. And Appadurai called it the capacity to aspire. The capacity of these very poor fishermen and rug pickers, etc., the bottom of society, for the first time started to imagine and to aspire, to have the hope, the wish that the future could be better. So this is still with us. Since I mentioned innovation as one of the driving forces, we have also fictional expectations of how technological innovations will unfold. Famous one is Gartner's hype cycle, well known to all the business schools and business students. And I think the graph speaks for itself. You have a new technology. Expectations go up, they are inflated. People think, this will conquer the market. I have to invest my money if I have money to invest in it. And then comes, the downfall, the period of disillusionment, and eventually what he calls the slope of enlightenment. You become a bit more realistic, and you realize your expectations had been inflated. And then you reach, indeed, the technology delivers something, you indeed reach a plateau of productivity. But mind you, this is a timeline. It's not the richness of the timescape that I asked you to think in. It's just one, technology taking out. You can perhaps measure it in terms of the stocks going up or the stocks going down, but it's only a much poorer, one-dimensional way of looking at what is happening. AI, that we all talk about every day, this is taken from the book of Max Tegmark, Life 3.0, where he also has a plaidoyer for the beneficial AI movement, responsibility of people who are working in the AI field to think of beneficial uses. And again, these are a lot of interesting questions for AI. But again, the societal richness of a timescape is not there. You're asking important questions, but unless you're able to place them in the timescape, give it this kind of contextual body, it will remain somewhat one-sided. And this raises questions of tempo. How fast will AI develop, evolve? Is it out of sync with our lifestyle? Is it out of sync with the way how we can adapt to this new technological environment? And it also raises questions about timing, tipping points, possible breakdowns on the way, etc. So let me finish now by coming to the third timescape that I announced at the beginning, and I call it the timescape of the now. And the timescape of the now, I think, is already around us. The old timescape is still with us, but there is a new timescape that, at least to me, seems to emerge, namely the importance of the present and of experience, the sheer complexity of living in our society, the sheer complexity of the economy. If you think of all the financial instruments that have been invented, developed within the past 20 years, the sheer complexity and how it impinges on social life, on the life of people, how to accommodate this complexity. And here I think we are partly, stumbling into an artificial future. We don't quite know where we are going, but, things are happening and we are stumbling in it. But I think there's also a new timescape that is emerging. And it's a timescape that is characterized by, on the one hand, the fact that we have never known so much about our past. We have an enormous amount of information. What we know about the universe, we are, every day, we are getting a new picture that is taken from one of these, from Kepler, from Hubble, from all the satellites and other probes that astronomers and cosmologists are sending out into space. We are looking at the past, because all the pictures that come in tell us something about the past of the universe, not about the present and not about the future. And we are learning every day so much about the paleontology, the paleogenomics that is discovering, by now we have some almost 1,000 genomes of ancient people that have been sequenced, that allow us to chart new migration routes, new kinds of lineages, etc. So it's enormous what we know about the past. We cannot possibly select and, what are we doing with this amount of the past information? What does it do to us? And at the same time, we are blind towards the future. The future remains uncertain. Whatever we think, we can predict a little bit, yes. And this is why I think we have to accommodate the predictions we make, the material and the information and the knowledge we get from the past. We have to accommodate it in the timescape of the now. And this is where ideas that you're all familiar with, like Kaufman's famous adjacent possible comes in. How do you know where the new will arise? Well, it's the adjacent possible, the space that you can map, but it's happening now. It's not in the future. And Stephen Johnson gave a slightly different definition than Kaufman. He called the adjacent possible as a kind of shadow future. What is a shadow future? If you think of it as something that you don't even see, but it casts a shadow into the present. And we have to accommodate it. There's a shadow, but the shadow comes from the future. And it's hovering on the edges of the present state of things, a map of all the ways in which the present can reinvent itself. There's this sense of enormous possibilities, enormous opportunities, and what are we to do with it? And this is the timescape of the now. Niklas Luhmann, the famous sociologist, once said, the present comprises everything. It's a banal sentence, but at the same time, if you think about it, it's also a deep sentence because it is about the timescape of the now. The present comprises everything because we experience, we get the information, we do something or don't do something with the knowledge we have. And so we have this peculiar state of having this overload from the past. We have an overload from the fictional future, from the uncertainty of the future. We have an enormous amount of complexity now, of contingency that goes together with complexity, in my view. And this makes it necessary for us to be much more aware, what do we select? And you can only select if you attach some kind of value. Whatever it is, it can be economic value, can be moral value, can be human values, to base your selection on it. And this is the task that I see in front of us in this timescape of the now. It's the timescapes of algorithms, which are nothing but a tool for ordering the traces that we have left from the past. But at the same time, they are laying out trajectories for an uncertain future. We can start to think, or some of you in complexity science are already doing this. What would a simulated timescape look like? How would you simulate it? You have to know about the processes that you want to simulate, about their tempo, about the duration, the order, when do unintended consequences, surprises, breakdowns enter. And there is this possibility that we start to explore, and I think complexity science is a wonderful way of starting to explore by simulating the timescape. How do we select and what are the values on which we base our selections? These values may not always be announced. We may not even know them. They may be tacit values, but we have to bring them out and make them explicit. So I want to end with a plea for the humanist timescape of the now. And the humanist dimension enters because we need in it a place for feelings, sorry for the misspelling, the feelings on how to govern our life. And according to Antonio Damasio, a very famous neuroscientist, it is our emotions, our feelings. And he, in the book, he describes it in great detail, how our feelings have created cultures. Because, and he goes back to bacteria and say bacteria, they don't have feelings in our sense, but they also have a way of responding to unpleasant things like pain and pleasant things like rewards. So even before the neural system was created, these organisms and creatures had a way of responding. And then gradually, we humans, with our neural apparatus, we were responding to pain and to unpleasant events and to pleasant ones. And this is the basis for the culture we have. And therefore, cultures have the possibility to decide, and they decide on the basis of values. How do you evaluate what is happening to you, and then you decide and do it now. So I started my talk by this quote, "We don't have a minute to lose." You remember? We don't have a minute to lose, and I was grateful for Jan that he gave me 45 minutes. And there is some truth to it. We don't have a minute to lose means there is this sense of urgency. Something has to happen now. And at the same time, and this is one of the contradictions, one of the conflicts in the timescape of now in which we live. We have the sense of urgency, and at the same time, we know we need time to reflect on it. Thank you.
So the floor is now open for the questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your talk, which I've much enjoyed. But may I just raise a point? It's not a question, but it's a point that when you say that, following on from Tony Damasio, that we feel pain and we feel pleasure and whatnot, it has to be recognized that this pain is highly compartmentalized. We feel the pain for some things, and the same identical situation which happen to people who are not close to us, we do not feel. The wonderful example, well, wonderful is a ghastly word to use, but one of the examples at the present time, not far from here, is Aung San Suu Kyi. She was wonderful in protecting democracy for her people, but totally indifferent to the pain of others. Totally indifferent. So I think we have to distinguish between, I would not call it pain, I would call it empathy, but empathy is highly compartmentalized. Now, there was a meeting at Cambridge 2 years ago when Helene Blumenfield, who was a very wonderful English sculptor, got up and said, she quoted Primo Levi saying that no one should write poetry after Auschwitz. And I got up and said to her, Helene, do you not realize that at Auschwitz, people were playing the most wonderful, the most beautiful music in the world the day before they were taking to massacre people? innocent people. So there's a huge compartmentalization, and I think that a future humanitarian politics should deal with this essential brain problem or brain characteristic.
Thank you. I'm not here to give Antonio Damasio's talk, so I just mentioned it as something that I think it's worth to read, and he goes into many of the details that you mentioned now. He is aware of it, and also we have studies now on psychopaths and people who apparently lack empathy, etc. But so it's a wide field of neuroscience studies. I take your point that differentiation is necessary, but the point I want to make is really that, there are cultures that have values, and it's on the basis of the values that they make decisions. Now, none of these values are forever. They are changing. And also, some of the values do not properly reflect the values of the people. So the government can have other values from what most people have. All this is part of the complexity in which we live.
But what I'm trying to argue is nothing to do with Damasio, really. What I'm trying to argue is that we ourselves have got to recognize that our values are not humanitarian in the sense of including the whole of humanity. They are very much tribally based. And that is one of the problems that we're facing in the world today.
Yeah. Damasio, in fact, he speaks about that, and he says, well, in biology, you have all kinds of organisms. It starts with with cells moving on to become multicellular organisms. And we as humans, we don't have the same propensity, of making an organism bigger by uniting. And this is part of the difference he sees between organisms other than humans and humans. But it's a wide field.
Thank you very much, Helga. That was really lovely, and I enjoyed it a great deal. I have two interrelated questions. The first is, consultants like to say that when you come up with ideas, they should be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So I can see that your 3 timescapes are mutually exclusive. Did you imagine them to be collectively exhaustive as well, or are there other timescapes out there? And then kind of part B is, what would you like us to take away from this in terms of how we live our lives? What are the implications of this, right, for how we go about navigating the rivers of time, to use the Ursula Le Guin phrase?
I'm not sure that I would say they are mutually exclusive, because there are always vestiges that are around. They are part of our culture, part of the stories we tell ourselves, but then they become, sidelined, or they become part of one particular sub-tribe or whatever. But so I think it's more some kind of, we still have to imagine the past. We need a way of accounting for societal change. I was mentioning one possibility, which is more quantitative. Historians, this will not mean historians will lose their jobs. They will still have to go into the archives, dig up the microdata, etc. But at the same time, there is room for a project that builds on the work that historians do. And at the same time, we will need the necessary fictions in economics, in society, in democracy, etc. So I would not say they are exclusive. What is the main message for living your life? This is a difficult question. I would say part of what the social sciences can tell you is not to take things for granted as they appear to be, but try to look behind it. How have these ideas or concepts that we take so much for granted, how have they come about? And always to be aware they can change. It's not that somebody says, now we change, and tomorrow the world will be different, apart from, a dictatorship where the mindsets can be controlled. But to be aware and to ask yourself, what is behind the concepts that we are using? And also, what I try to say with the graphs, it's we need a visual representation. You can say this about every image you see. With images, we know they are images, but at the same time, there is so much food for thought. How do the images come about? What do they do with us? How do we react to them? That's what artists play with. And so I would say this is the message. We have the possibilities today to get the best out of what science can tell us, what social science can tell us, what the humanities and arts can tell us. But we have to put it together, and it's a bit of work.
The three timescapes, I was trying to, how they may apply to two different peoples. Now each one has a span of history of 4,000 or 5,000 years, but there's a huge disparity in population size. One is about 0.2% of the world's population, whereas the other one is about 20% of the world's population. So when I apply the first timescape of imagined futures, the one with the small population strikes me right away because politically they were extinguished multiple times in history, and yet they were have been able to come back again.
Sorry, I don't quite understand who has been extinguished when and who comes back. I did not quite
sorry,
understand
I
it.
forgot to mention. I'm thinking specifically of the Hebrew people, which today takes the form of Israel. That's the one with the small population. I think about 1.2% of the world's total population. And the other one would be the Chinese people, 20% of the world's population, and how these three timescapes apply to them. So,
a timescape for me, and I said this I think twice or three times, it needs a time frame, and you set the time frame. You specify, I'm now looking at this particular period in this part of the world with these kind of people in it. So a timescape is a concept, but it needs a frame. And depending on the question you ask, you choose the frame. That's the presupposition. A timescape is not something that you can just take from a shelf and put it wherever. You have to be aware what is the frame and how is it related to my question. Now, whatever you mention, you can do it, but I did not do it here. You can do it and ask these questions, and then you will have possibly different timescapes. I'm not saying, these are the only timescapes. There is a great variety of timescapes. I found it useful because the theme of this conference is complexity. And I wanted to show how these three timescapes that I have chosen, this is my framing, because it's my question that I have posed here to you, how this is related. But you can use other timescapes. You tell us, please, this is my question, and this is why I use it in this particular way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really interesting, not interesting, but just really good lecture, especially after lunch, for all of us to stay awake. This is really good. I want to come back to the topic of images and visualization. Would you be happier if the visualization was in 3-dimension rather than 2-dimension? Perhaps even more along the lines of something architectural, so that you can actually show compartments, complexity, relationship, power struggles, and all that. Is that a better idea than flat charts and 2D?
You know, I have nothing against two-dimensional images and representation. I think, again, it depends on the questions you ask. As you most likely are aware, during the Renaissance, you know, there were images that were three-dimensional. People knew how to image, and there were certain rules that guided you to have an architecture of memory that was related to the architecture of the building in which you spoke. So there are these mental models that may help you. And again, I would say it depends very much on the question you are interested in. And for some questions, it may be great if you have an architecture and you move in three-dimensional space. May also be interesting for certain questions to put on the Google glasses and you move in virtual space, but you will discover, you know, another part, and it's another timescape that you will discover. So it's not about what I'm happier with, it's just I want to tell you, be aware of what are your questions and choose the timescape accordingly, and be aware of what the timescape is able to answer and what it does.
My question is relating to this issue of you don't have a minute to lose.
Okay.
Now, really, that particular quote relates to a time of rapid changes, and in today's environment, there's rapid change. And if we were in an environment where there is no stability, there's not much of a change, really these issues don't arise. Every day is the same. So what's the big difference? So perhaps in today's environment with such fast changes and accelerating change, the next one will be you don't have a second to lose. And it'll go on like this because you are standing on a hot stove or something, you've got to keep running all the time. And where does it stop? That's my first question. The second one is, this is about predicting the future. We heard about the adjacent future. While some people say that you can't predict the future, actually, it's only partially right, that statement, because when you plan, when companies plan, they are actually planning the future. And they go about trying to create that future. And when we do research and research labs and so forth, we are trying to create the future. And that's why we're able to at least vision the future and create. So it's partly, it's not totally right to say that you can't predict the future. You can predict the future, but perhaps you can't predict it explicitly to the level of detail that one wants for one to be able to act. Thank you.
There is one concept that is very important in the social sciences that I need to introduce now to you, and it's called performativity. And what it means is a way of capturing what you are saying. You said you create the future in the lab. This is related to the fictional expectations that you have. Because the future is uncertain, the future is not there by definition. But you do something that captures the future according to your expectations, according to the as-if. But by doing so, and this is where performativity comes in, you actually are able to change a bit of the reality. So whatever you do, you perform, and the performance, depending on the power structure, the environment, etc., has certain results. Sometimes it can be very powerful. If you look at the way how the President of the United States sends out his Twitters, this is performativity at a certain level.
Okay, let's take a last question here.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for a very nice talk, and it was very interesting to see the timescape from the social aspect. I work with the individual.
Now you need to be closer or have another microphone.
Okay, let's try this one. Is it
Yeah,
better?
that's much
okay, great.
better.
So it's very interesting to look at this timescape from the social aspect as opposed to just the individual, which is my time scale, so to speak, or my spatial scale. But I'm going to ask a question that's not relevant to time necessarily, as much as whether you could extend this notion of timescape to the sort of, and the uncertainty of the future, and link into the notions of post-truth era that we've been hearing about, this notion of dissolution of reality, so to speak. Is it, do you think, linked to this notion of uncertainty you see in the timescape you propose?
Well, it's another lecture. I think, the fake news, which is not exactly post-truth, but fake news is really nothing new. And, it has existed in antiquity, it has existed in the Renaissance. We have even records of the people working at the Medici court and related courts. We know who the people were who were writing fake news deliberately, because this was one way, of doing politics. We know about the propaganda before the First World War, during, after, etc. So fake news is nothing new. What is perhaps new is that this link of trusting authority, be it the political, the scientific, the expert authority, has taken a severe blow in much of Western societies due to the erosion of trust. People feel no longer represented by the authority. And I think in particular, the way how expertise is being dismantled, it's being downgraded to say, well, it's just another opinion. And here we have to see it's very much linked to vested interests. We can see this with climate change denial. There are the massive interests of the oil and gas industry involved in how it's being done in the US. You also can see in Europe, we don't have climate change denial. People don't do it enough, but no one says it's not true. So I think we have ways of understanding what goes on, which does not mean that we have the kind of solutions that will turn out to be effective. We still have to work on that. Yeah.
Let's thank Helga Nowotny one more time.